Colorado man now arrested for the second time in the death of his wife is awaiting extradition from Arizona. Barry Morphew is accused of killing Suzanne Morphew, who is reported missing on Mother's Day in 2020 in Chaffee County. Her remains discovered in 2023, more than a year after the first case against Barry Morphew was dropped. Part of the reason for the dismissal involved issues with evidence.
Her body was found in a shallow grave, wildlife tranquilizers coursing through her remains. A loving mother vanished on Mother's Day. Her husband's truck door opened and closed 80 times in the darkness. And 3 years later, when investigators finally discovered what was left of Suzanne Morphew buried in the wilderness, the chilling evidence pointed to one terrifying conclusion: she had been hunted like an animal. Welcome back to Cold Crime Cases. What you're about to hear is a story that twisted through deception, betrayal, and a husband's obsession with control that may have ended in the most brutal way imaginable. Before we dive into this haunting investigation, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, smash the like button, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Are you listening from Colorado? Maybe you're all the way across the world? Let us know. Your engagement helps us bring you more deep dives into cases that demand justice. And trust me, you'll want to follow this channel for what comes next. Now, let's talk about Suzanne Morphew. April 11th, 1971. That's the day Suzanne came into this world in Alexandria, Indiana, born to parents Jean and Adrian. She grew up surrounded by love, with 2 brothers, David and Andrew, in a close-knit family that adored her. Everyone who crossed paths with Suzanne remembered her the same way: brilliant, thoughtful, compassionate. She had this magnetic energy that drew people in. She was the kind of woman who lit up every room she entered. In 1998, while still navigating the halls of high school, Suzanne met a young athlete named Barry Morphew. He was a standout baseball player, talented enough to catch the eye of professional scouts. Their connection was immediate, and after 6 years of dating, they made it official. They married, ready to build their future together. Barry's baseball dreams seemed within reach when the Toronto Blue Jays signed him. Suzanne, meanwhile, pursued her passion for education at Purdue University, determined to make a difference in young lives. But fate had other plans. A devastating injury shattered Barry's professional sports career before it truly began. He pivoted, channeling his energy into horticulture and eventually launching a landscaping company that would become increasingly successful. Suzanne thrived as a teacher for 4 years, molding young minds with the same warmth and dedication she brought to everything else. Together, they welcomed 2 daughters into the world, Mallory and Macy. From the outside looking in, they had achieved the American dream: a beautiful family, financial stability, a picture-perfect life in Indiana. But darkness has a way of finding even the brightest lights. Suzanne was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. Twice, she stared down this merciless disease, and twice, she fought her way back, refusing to let cancer write her ending. By 2018, after conquering her second battle, the Morphews decided they needed a fresh start, a chance to breathe new air, to be closer to their daughter Mallory, who was attending Western State University. They packed up their lives and moved to Maysville, Colorado, purchasing a stunning 7-acre property nestled in the mountains. It was paradise. Barry could hunt to his heart's content on their own land while still running his contracting business. He even volunteered as a firefighter, presenting himself as a pillar of the community. Suzanne retired from teaching, pouring herself into their church and discovering new passions. Mountain biking became her escape, a way to connect with the breathtaking wilderness surrounding their new home. Everything seemed perfect. But perfection, as we know, is often just a carefully constructed illusion. Cracks were forming beneath the surface of the Morphew marriage. Deep, jagged cracks that Suzanne tried desperately to hide from the world. She was afraid of being alone in a room with her own husband. She kept a detailed list of grievances on her phone, documenting a pattern that terrified her: physical intimidation, controlling behavior, his drinking, his rage. She suspected Barry was being unfaithful, and when she tried to confront him about divorce, he wouldn't even entertain the conversation. Suzanne felt trapped in her own life, so she reached out to someone from her past, Jeff, a man she'd known in high school. What started as reconnection evolved into a full-blown affair that lasted a year and a half. It was her lifeline, her secret escape from a marriage that had become a prison. Ironically, Suzanne had purchased a spy pen to catch Barry in what she believed was his own affair. That pen would later be discovered by investigators, but it hadn't captured Barry's infidelity. It captured hers. May 10th, 2020, Mother's Day. This should have been a day of celebration, a family gathered together to honor the woman who held them all together. Instead, it became the day Suzanne Morphew vanished from the face of the earth. That morning started strangely. Barry claimed he had a landscaping job waiting for him in Broomfield, a town sitting 3 hours away by car. He left early, or so he said. The girls, Mallory and Macy, had gone on a camping trip, planning to return that evening to celebrate Mother's Day with their mom. But as the day wore on, something felt wrong. The girls sent their mother text messages, wishing her a happy Mother's Day, expecting the flood of emojis and love she always sent back. Nothing. Radio silence. They knew their mother was glued to her phone, especially that day, as she'd been excited to see photos from a friend's daughter's wedding. She was active on social media constantly. Her silence was deafening. Growing concerned, Mallory and Macy reached out to their neighbors, Martin and Mrs. Ritter, asking them to check on their mother. Around 4 to 4:30 that afternoon, Mrs. Ritter made the short trip to the Morphew residence. The house was empty, disturbingly empty. She immediately called Barry, explaining that Suzanne was nowhere to be found. Barry's response was oddly specific. He told her to look for Suzanne's mountain bike. If the bike was missing, he instructed, call the police immediately. And that's exactly what she did. Within hours, deputies descended on the Morphew property, beginning a search that would eventually consume thousands of investigative hours. Barry and his daughters rushed home, desperate for answers about Suzanne's whereabouts. Every time someone scrolls past, another woman's suffering fades into silence. Don't let that happen. Subscribe, and make her story matter. The first major clue emerged quickly. 2 deputies discovered Suzanne's mountain bike lying off a steep ravine not far from the Morphew home. At first glance, you might think, tragic accident. A bike ride gone horribly wrong. But seasoned investigators know that crime scenes tell stories, and this one wasn't adding up. There were no skid marks indicating she'd tried to brake. The bike itself showed no damage despite supposedly tumbling down the side of a ravine. No blood anywhere. The surrounding vegetation remained undisturbed, as if the bike had been gently placed there rather than involved in any kind of crash or struggle. One deputy's assessment was chilling in its simplicity. This was obviously placed there by somebody. When investigators presented Barry with their findings, his reaction was bizarre. He immediately began theorizing that a mountain lion must have attacked Suzanne while she was riding. He fixated on this explanation with an intensity that struck investigators as strange. Why was he so certain? Why that specific theory? In a secretly recorded conversation that later surfaced, Barry went into even more detail about his mountain lion hypothesis, speaking about it as if it were established fact rather than wild speculation. But here's what made investigators' antennae really start twitching. Barry was notably absent from the search parties organized by Suzanne's brother, Andrew. Andrew didn't buy Barry's story for a second. He suspected Suzanne might have been taken on May 9th instead of Mother's Day itself. And then came the discovery that shifted everything. Suzanne's helmet was found 1 mile away from the Morphew home. But here's the crucial detail. It was discovered in the exact opposite direction from where Barry claimed to have driven that morning. His truck's telematic data, the digital breadcrumbs that modern vehicles leave behind, showed he'd driven 1 mile west from their home before heading to Broomfield. That's 1 mile toward where Suzanne's helmet was found. 1 mile in the exact opposite direction of his supposed destination. When confronted with this undeniable data, Barry didn't miss a beat. He had an explanation ready. He claimed he'd been up scouting elk at 4:30 that morning, curious about which direction they were heading so he could track them later. Apparently, Barry had a hobby of tranquilizing elk and removing their antlers to sell. But investigators immediately spotted the problem with this story. Barry had told them in his initial interview that his alarm had woken him at 4:30, and he'd left straight for Broomfield. So how could he have been out scouting elk at 4:30 if he was just waking up at 4:30? Barry quickly amended his story. Actually, he said, he hadn't set an alarm. He'd just woken up on his own. The lies were beginning to pile up. When investigators asked Barry to walk them through May 9th, the day before Suzanne was reported missing, he painted an idyllic picture. It was one of the best days they'd had in a long time, he claimed. He'd been working with a coworker in Salida that morning, came home early, went on a hike with Suzanne, and then they'd grilled steaks together. They'd been intimate, he said. They went to bed together, and that might have been the last time anyone saw her alive. It was a touching story. A final, perfect day before tragedy struck. There was just one problem. Almost none of it was true. When investigators pulled Barry's phone records and vehicle telematic data for May 9th, they uncovered a timeline that contradicted virtually everything he'd told them. Between 2:42 and 2:44 in the afternoon, Barry's phone showed erratic movement around the property. When asked about it, he claimed he'd been hunting chipmunks with tranquilizers. Chipmunks. Then, at 2:47 p.m., Barry switched his phone to airplane mode. It stayed that way until 10:17 that night. Why would someone turn their phone to airplane mode for nearly 8 hours in the middle of the day? That romantic steak dinner Barry described? Investigators found only one dirty plate in the house. Not two. One. And then came the detail that made investigators certain they were looking at a crime scene rather than a missing person case. At 9:30 p.m., an hour after Barry claimed he and Suzanne had gone to sleep together, his truck moved. The telematic data showed the vehicle reversed 96 feet backward from the driveway. Why would someone's truck move backward nearly 100 feet while they're supposedly asleep? Investigators developed a theory. This was when Barry loaded Suzanne's body into the truck. But it gets worse. If stories like this make you want to protect the innocent and expose the truth, then don't just watch. Subscribe. That single click could be the reason another story finally gets heard. Between 3:25 and 3:48 a.m. on May 10th, the data revealed something deeply disturbing. Barry's truck door opened and closed more than 80 times. 80 times. What could possibly require someone to open and close their vehicle door 80 times in the middle of the night? Investigators began to piece together a horrifying scenario, but they needed more information. They started interviewing Barry's co-workers, and that's when more lies unraveled. Barry wasn't supposed to be in Broomfield on May 10th at all. Their contract didn't start for another week. There was no project to inspect, no legitimate reason for the trip. According to Barry's account, he'd only visited the Holiday Inn, briefly checked the job site, stopped at a store for granola bars and water, and made a quick stop at McDonald's to clean his windshield. But surveillance footage told a dramatically different story. Cameras captured Barry disposing of 5 trash bags at various locations near the McDonald's and Holiday Inn. When confronted with the footage, Barry had another convenient explanation. He just wanted to clean out his car and didn't want to pay proper disposal fees. Except when investigators examined his car, it wasn't particularly dirty. And there was something else. One of Barry's co-workers reported smelling a strong odor of bleach and chlorine in Barry's hotel room the day after Suzanne disappeared. Investigators also discovered that Barry had changed his clothes multiple times throughout May 10th, which struck them as odd behavior for someone supposedly working a construction job. All of this evidence painted a damning picture, but investigators still needed a motive. Why would Barry kill his wife? The answer was hiding in plain sight, locked away in Suzanne's phone and personal belongings. When investigators finally gained access to Suzanne's devices, they uncovered a marriage in absolute crisis. Text messages between Suzanne and friends revealed the depth of her unhappiness. In her phone's notes app, she'd kept a detailed record of Barry's behavior. Incidents of physical intimidation, his drinking, his refusal to even discuss divorce, his attempts to control her every move. One note stood out above all others. "I'm afraid to be alone in a room with him." These weren't the words of a woman in a healthy marriage. These were the words of someone living in fear. And then there was the affair with Jeff. That spy pen Suzanne had purchased to catch Barry's suspected infidelity had instead documented her secret relationship with a man from her past. Text messages revealed the affair had been going on for a year and a half, starting around 2018. Suzanne had confided in Jeff about her misery, her fear, her desperate desire to escape. While Jeff seemed like an obvious suspect, investigators quickly cleared him. He had airtight alibis for the relevant time frame. But here's what made investigators certain they were on the right track. A note Suzanne had written just 2 days before she disappeared. In it, she mentioned that Barry had confronted her, accusing her of having a boyfriend. He knew, or at least, he suspected. The evidence suggested Barry had discovered the affair, and something inside him had snapped. On May 20th, investigators executed a search warrant on the Morphew residence. What they discovered painted a chilling picture of what they believed had happened. In the family dryer, they found the cap of a tranquilizer dart. Just the cap, sitting there among the clothes. In the bedroom, a spent bullet casing. The door frame showed significant damage, as if there had been a violent struggle. And in the fireplace, they discovered what appeared to be the remnants of Suzanne's journal, burned to ashes. All of these findings, combined with the telematic data and Barry's endless stream of changing stories, pointed to a horrifying conclusion. Imagine if it was your daughter, your sister, or your friend. Would you want their story buried under noise or told with care? Subscribing helps make sure nobody's story fades away. Not ready to subscribe? That's okay. But at least tell me why in the comments. I want to learn from you. Investigators believed Barry had tranquilized his wife sometime in the afternoon of May 9th, likely around the time his phone went into airplane mode. Suzanne's phone data supported this timeline. She'd sent her boyfriend Jeff 53 text messages throughout the day, along with a selfie at around 2 to 10 p.m. After that, her phone went silent. Forever. Investigators theorized that Barry had shot Suzanne with a tranquilizer dart, then chased her through the house as the drugs took effect. The broken door frame suggested a confrontation, a desperate attempt to escape. Once she was unconscious or dead, Barry had loaded her body into his truck during that 9:30 pendulum reversal, captured by the telematic data. Those 80-plus door openings in the early morning hours? Investigators believed that was Barry disposing of evidence. The trash bags captured on surveillance footage likely contained Suzanne's belongings, cleaning supplies, anything that might link him to her death. The public didn't learn that Barry was a suspect until 2 weeks after Suzanne's disappearance, when police conducted a 2-day excavation of one of Barry's construction sites in Salida. In response, Barry released a video to the public. Standing with his daughters, he proclaimed his innocence, insisting he had nothing to do with Suzanne's disappearance. It was an odd performance, his demeanor not quite matching someone whose wife had vanished without a trace. Nearly a year passed before authorities felt they had enough evidence to move forward. On May 5, 2021, Barry Morphew was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, tampering with physical evidence, possession of a dangerous weapon, and attempting to influence a public servant. And if that wasn't damning enough, Barry was later charged with an additional crime that revealed his character in stark detail: filing a fraudulent election ballot in Suzanne's name. When confronted about voting on behalf of his missing wife, Barry's explanation was chilling in its casual disregard for the law. "I didn't know it was wrong," he claimed. "Trump could use the extra vote." He eventually pled guilty to that charge and paid a $600 fine. In August 2021, a preliminary hearing was held to determine if the case against Barry would proceed to trial. Over 4 days, the prosecution methodically presented their evidence, walking through their theory of what had happened. They argued that Barry had murdered Suzanne on May 9th, dismembered her body in a hotel room, disposed of the tools he'd used, and buried her remains in an unmarked grave somewhere in the vast Colorado wilderness. But Barry's defense team came out swinging. They pointed out that cadaver dogs had failed to detect any human remains in Barry's vehicle or in the hotel room where he'd allegedly dismembered his wife's body. They highlighted visual inconsistencies in photographs taken of the dryer where the tranquilizer cap was found. In some photos, the cap was clearly visible. In others, it wasn't. Had evidence been planted? The defense also claimed that Barry's tranquilizer gun had been broken at the time of Suzanne's disappearance, making it impossible for him to have used it in the alleged murder. But their biggest bombshell came when they revealed something the prosecution had failed to disclose. Partial DNA had been discovered in Suzanne's Range Rover and on her bike helmet. DNA that didn't match Barry. DNA that matched profiles from 3 unsolved sexual assault investigations in Chicago and Arizona. This revelation dropped like an explosion in the courtroom. There was potentially another suspect. A suspected serial predator whose DNA placed him in connection with Suzanne's disappearance. Why hadn't the prosecution revealed this earlier? The investigator who'd collected the DNA evidence had gone on military leave before he could follow up on the lead. And critically, the prosecution had never informed the defense of these DNA matches, a violation of their obligation to provide exculpatory evidence. The defense argued passionately that with another viable suspect in the picture, someone with a documented history of sexual violence, the prosecution didn't have enough evidence to convict Barry beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge delayed his decision, citing the hundreds of man-hours and resources invested in the case. Finally, on September 7th, he ruled that the case would proceed to trial. Barry's bail was set at $500,000. If you're still watching and haven't subscribed, I'm honestly curious what's holding you back. Drop it in the comments. I actually want to know. On September 20th, 2021, Barry walked out of county jail flanked by his daughters, having posted bail. His freedom, however, would be short-lived in terms of his legal battle. 9 days before the trial was set to begin, the prosecution filed a motion that shocked everyone following the case. They were dismissing all charges against Barry Morphew without prejudice. The motion cited several factors: the lack of a body, the reasonable doubt created by the unknown DNA matches, and critically, prosecutorial misconduct. The prosecution had missed multiple deadlines, resulting in 14 key witnesses being excluded from the trial. Without those witnesses, without Suzanne's body, and with another potential suspect lurking in the evidence, the prosecution didn't believe they could secure a conviction. Barry emerged from the courthouse with a triumphant smile, his daughters at his side. To many observers, it looked like he'd gotten away with murder, but the story wasn't over. September 22nd, 2023. More than 3 years after Suzanne vanished, a group of investigators from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation was conducting a search of an area in Moffett, Saguache County, as part of a separate, unrelated investigation. They discovered several shallow graves. Human remains. On September 27th, those remains were positively identified through dental records and a chemotherapy port still present in the body. Suzanne Morphew had been found. Her grave was located more than 50 miles from the search area that had been the focus of the investigation. 50 miles from the mountains surrounding the Morphew property. 50 miles from where investigators had spent countless hours searching. The discovery raised explosive questions. Police were certain that Barry's truck hadn't been in Moffat on May 9th or 10th. The telematic data would have shown such a journey. So if Barry was responsible for Suzanne's death, how did her body end up so far from the search area? Some investigators theorized that Barry had help. Perhaps he'd made the trip to Moffat days or weeks later to move the body. If investigators obtained subpoenas for Barry's phone and vehicle data covering a longer time period, they might be able to link him to the burial site. Others pointed to the DNA evidence found in Suzanne's vehicle and speculated that she might have fallen victim to a serial killer whose identity remained unknown. In April 2024, the autopsy results were finally released, and they provided a crucial piece of the puzzle that investigators had been waiting for. Suzanne's death was ruled a homicide. The cause of death was listed as undetermined means, but critically, the toxicology report detected a cocktail of wildlife tranquilizers in her remains: butorphanol, azapirone, and medetomidine. The same combination of drugs Barry Morphew had admitted using to tranquilize elk. The same tranquilizer dart cap found in the Morphew family dryer. This changed everything. On June 18, 2025, a grand jury reviewed the evidence and returned an indictment. Barry Morphew was charged once again with first-degree murder in the death of his wife. He was arrested on June 20th in Arizona, where he'd been living, and subsequently extradited back to Colorado. The new indictment included details that sent shockwaves through those who'd been following the case. Prosecutors now believe that Suzanne's body was moved at least twice after her death. The forensic evidence suggested she'd been killed at the Morphew residence, moved to a secondary location, and then finally transported to the shallow grave in Moffat where she was discovered. This would explain why Barry's truck data didn't show a trip to Moffat immediately after her disappearance. He'd hidden her body somewhere else first, somewhere close by, and moved her later when the initial search frenzy had died down. The theory painted a picture of a calculating killer who'd carefully planned not just the murder, but the disposal and concealment of his victim's body. Barry appeared in court in July 2025, pleading not guilty to the charges. His bond was set at $3 million, which he eventually posted with help from supporters who still believe in his innocence. This took me hours of painful research, reading autopsies, police files, and the cries of women that were ignored. If you felt safe watching from your screen, the least you can do is hit that red subscribe button. His attorney, Iris Itan, has been vocal in defending Barry, continuing to point to the unknown DNA found in Suzanne's vehicle and suggesting that she fell victim to a serial killer. Itan has accused law enforcement of tunnel vision, focusing solely on Barry while ignoring other viable suspects. She's called for authorities to admit they were wrong in targeting Barry, claiming he was wrongfully charged in his wife's disappearance and death. Barry himself has filed a $15 million lawsuit against the prosecutors, sheriff's office, and multiple investigators, alleging malicious prosecution and violation of his civil rights. Meanwhile, the district attorney's office remains resolute. They've stated the case is still under active investigation and they will not comment on specific evidence until trial. They've offered condolences to Suzanne's family while making it clear they believe justice will be served. So where does this leave us? We have a woman who lived in fear of her husband, documenting his behavior in secret notes on her phone. A woman who was having an affair, desperately seeking connection and escape from a controlling marriage. We have a husband whose stories changed repeatedly, whose vehicle and phone data placed him in suspicious locations at suspicious times. A husband who disposed of trash bags in the middle of the night, whose truck door opened and closed 80 times, whose hotel room reeked of bleach. We have wildlife tranquilizers found in Suzanne's remains, matching the exact type Barry admitted using on elk. A tranquilizer cap found in the family dryer. A broken door frame suggesting a violent confrontation. But we also have unknown DNA from a suspected serial predator found in Suzanne's vehicle and on her helmet, DNA that creates reasonable doubt about Barry's sole involvement. The question that haunts this case is simple but profound. What really happened to Suzanne Morphew? Was she murdered by her husband, a man she'd come to fear, who couldn't bear the thought of her leaving him for another man? Did Barry tranquilize her like one of his elk, then spend hours that night disposing of evidence before moving her body to a grave he'd carefully prepared? Or did she encounter a dangerous predator during what was meant to be a peaceful bike ride, falling victim to a serial offender whose identity we still don't know? The evidence points in multiple directions, creating a complex puzzle that investigators and eventually a jury will have to piece together. What we know for certain is this: Suzanne Morphew deserved better. She deserved to watch her daughters grow up, to grow old, to live free from fear. Instead, her life was cut short at 49 years old, and her body was left in a shallow grave in the wilderness for 3 years before anyone found her. Her family deserves answers. They deserve justice, and they deserve the truth, whatever that truth may be. If this was your daughter, sister, or friend, would you really scroll away without doing something as small as clicking subscribe? As this case moves forward to trial, we'll be watching closely. The prosecution will present their evidence of Barry's involvement, walking the jury through those suspicious phone records, that telematic data, those changing stories. The defense will point to the unknown DNA, arguing that reasonable doubt prevents any conviction, and that Barry was wrongfully targeted by investigators who ignored other suspects. A jury will ultimately decide whether Barry Morphew murdered his wife or whether the real killer remains at large. What do you think happened? Do you believe Barry is guilty, or do you think investigators got it wrong? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive compelling, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Subscribe to Cold Crime Cases for more investigations into mysteries that demand answers. And share this video with anyone who's interested in true crime. Justice for Suzanne Morphew isn't just about solving a case. It's about giving a voice to a woman who can no longer speak for herself. It's about ensuring that whoever is responsible for her death is held accountable. We'll keep following this story as it develops, bringing you updates as the trial approaches and new information emerges. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop asking questions. If you care about justice for women like her, hit subscribe. If you don't, say it in the comments, because ignoring her helps the next abuser win. This is Cold Crime Cases, signing off.